my work, in fact, I mean, I would say many of the things that I've worked on actually are pushing kind of beyond or outside of a modernist paradigm or very critical of a modernist paradigm. So if I think about it, it's maybe only in that sense, as a point of
Critique of it.
opposition or mhm.
And so what would be that point of opposition then? What
I
are
mean,
what's
there are many, but for instance, thinking about the transformations in avant-garde cinema from, I guess, what you could say is like the high modernist moment of structural filmmaking in the 1970s to a more pluralistic, kind of contaminated, impure form of filmmaking that kind of comes after that. That would be one
Mhm.
instance.
I mean, obviously, what follows modernism, in a way, it's postmodernism, which is
Hmm.
rejection of kind of singular, kind of deterministic nature of modernism. But then maybe is postmodernism something that's kind of evident in film as a
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, in different ways, like people have talked about postmodernism in relation to Hollywood film, to auteur cinema, but I think, you can also see it within artist film practices and in an extremely kind
Mhm.
of strong way.
Yeah, so I guess something that I was just saying to you that I was feeling quite, in a sense, overwhelmed with, which is not usually the kind of way I feel as I embark on these conversations. And I think it's mainly because I guess you're an academic. And what an academic does is like engage with a kind of entire landscape of, let's say, a medium in this case. So I wonder, is it a medium that unifies your interest, or how would you define that landscape that you are kind of untangling
I
through like
mean, I'm a
what?
scholar of cinema and media studies, and so in that sense, I mean, a medium is part of it, but not necessarily a very strong unifying principle. Because, for instance, I mean, you can talk about photochemical film as a medium, but within that, there are many different formats of photochemical film. So it's not exactly like a unified thing in any way. And then, of course, various video formats. People now talk about, the moving image rather than film or video. So I don't know that medium would be like a totally unifying term, but it certainly comes into play, I guess.
So what would be the unifying, what would be that
I
thing?
would say a certain set of historical practices and institutions, rather than sort of taking something like a medium and presuming it to be this ontological thing that exists, eternally or something like that. I mean, I would say a lot of my work has dealt with how different kinds of experimental moving image practices exist in relation to institutions or also against institutions in the case of some experimental film practices.
And where does that interest come from?
That is my training. It's my academic training. It's also my interest. I mean, initially when I was going to university, I thought I would be a double major in art history and film studies because my interests were really across, especially contemporary art and cinema. But in the end, I opted I mean, I took many classes in art history, but my degree was a film studies degree, ultimately within a kind of liberal arts North American model. Um, and yeah, I have always been really interested specifically in experimental practices. Um, I like the idea, for instance, of embracing a medium like film, which is so non-innocent, so tied to mass culture, so highly capitalized, and then thinking about, how this thing that we normally associate with very popular practices can be kind of twisted or subverted in some way.
And then you're mentioning kind of institutional framework within which is it within which film operates, or is it within which film is made, or through?
Both,
Mhm.
absolutely both.
And so can you give me an example of let's say a work that really talks about this kind of relationship between
I
making
mean,
what
most
and
works don't talk about it, but I
Mhm.
would say that it's my kind of duty as a historian to be the one to explain actually, how works are determined by certain systems of production, value, exhibition, and so on. Um, so for instance, like, in my first book, wrote a lot about the way that the moving image really entered art spaces in the 1990s. I think in order to really take account of
Mhm.
that, it's not just about what artists are making or what artists are interested in. It's also about thinking about why were museums so eager to exhibit so many projected images during this time? So to think about those institutional determinations, that's not a property of any given artwork, but it's about the way that those artworks are moving through different kinds of institutional structures. So it's more of a methodological question, I would say.
But I guess a work does. Mhm. It's interesting what you're saying, but I guess still the story is still told through how, let's say, a single work is perceived as it kind of moves through this, let's say, landscape of either institution.
I don't know. There could be a lot of ways of telling that story. You could look at curatorial practice, for instance,
Mhm.
and kind of shift the frame away from any one particular work.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know. I mean, this is work that I also, did maybe 15 years ago or something. The work I'm doing now is not so related to these questions. But yeah, in fact, in a way, the whole point is to not dwell on one single work or one single author.
Yeah,
Um,
I guess that's maybe why I felt overwhelmed because your work perhaps doesn't do that. And so there isn't a kind of canon. There's also a certain relationship to kind of that kind of dematerialization of
I mean, I think I work in relation to a canon. But I think that, as is the case with many scholars, most scholars at this point, I would say, the project has been to produce revisionist histories, and kind of alternate genealogies. And so, in that sense, I think there's always a presumed idea of a canon, maybe in the background. And I'm operating in relation to that, like maybe in critical ways.
I get presumably you acknowledge it, you acknowledge its existence, you kind of work in relation to it. But I guess what is the criticality in what sense? In what sense do you critically approach the canon?
I mean, for instance, in experimental film, there are certain canonical books that one could say lay out, a set of works that count. Um, as widely, agreed to be important works. So we could think of something like P. Adam Sidney's book, Visionary Film. This was like the textbook that I used as an undergraduate when I was first taking a class on experimental film. If you look at that book, you will see that, first of all, it deals only with photochemical works. Second of all, it deals only with works made for a cinema context. No works of expanded cinema, no installations, and so on, even though some of the figures that are in that book were also working in those other spaces. It is a book that is specifically about American experimental film. That's present in the title. It is an exclusively, I believe, white history, if I'm not wrong, and it's an almost exclusively male history. Okay, this book was immensely important. But just from the description I've given, I think we can see very quickly how there would be many places where one would want to kind of push and tug at the edges of that history to kind of paint a fuller picture. of the kinds of practices that were occurring during the same period. And so, in many ways, I think the work that I've done, whether it's in looking at relationships between the cinema and the gallery, or whether it's looking at the histories of feminist work, whether it's looking at interactions between experimental film and documentary film. These are all places where we see a kind of breach happening out of that more enclosed canonical history. But I think, that now in 2025, I don't even think we can say that that history is the canonical history anymore because it has been so contested and so worked over and rewritten by scholars, basically since it was published. It has never ceased to be contested, but I think especially in the last 25 years or so, there's been a huge amount of publishing in experimental film history that's seeking to kind of think differently about these histories.
So I guess in many ways you're a historian. Is that how you would see it?
Sure. Yeah, I'm a film historian, film theorist. Yeah.
And so, and are you an archaeologist? So is there an element, an aspect of the work that is actually uncovering, discovering things?
Well, I'm a researcher, so in that sense, like hopefully that's what happens. I mean, I think in my field, the idea of archaeology brings with it a whole other set of methodological questions. Um, And I have done some work that I guess would conform to that, like a project that I did about Polavision, which is a small gauge film format that was issued by the Polaroid Corporation very briefly between 1977 and 79 or so. And it was a home format that would instantaneously develop, sort of like the motion picture equivalent of a Polaroid still photographic camera. And so this was a media archaeological project in the sense that I was looking back at like a failed medium, a dead medium. And thinking about how, even though this was a photochemical format, it actually has lots of elements of um, qualities that we would probably more readily associate with video, like feedback, instantaneity, and a kind of sociality that prefigures much more recent uses of image on social media platforms. So this was a kind of media archaeological project in a stricter sense. Um, but, when one does research, of course, it's about trying to uncover things and learn things. I'm very skeptical of rhetorics of discovery. So I don't know that I would describe it in those terms, but
But I guess what's interesting in your work is that kind of the research in film or these kind of let's say time-based media leads to conclusions about, let's say, society more broadly. I mean, there's political conclusions that you draw.
I mean, this I would say is what the discipline of film and media studies most often does. Maybe not all of it, not everyone, but I don't think that that's an unusual thing. I mean, to me, I'm not that interested in this sort of, yeah, enclosed formalist history.
Do you feel like you have an agenda? Do you feel like, and I guess what is,
We all do.
yes, and where, I guess, where does that come from in your case?
You know, I don't know, since I was an undergraduate, there are certain things that have really interested me, and in some way they've remained very consistent,
Mhm.
but of course, as a scholar, one is always trying to respond to the state of the field in some way, which is changing all the time, to the state of the world in some way, which is changing all the time. Um, I mean, it's about trying to determine where one can intervene in some way. So for instance, when I was an undergraduate, I was very interested in feminist avant-garde film. That was not something that I worked on explicitly, for instance, during my PhD or initially after, but then at a certain moment later came back to that and did like a large curatorial research project on that. And of course, that return to that material was prompted by all kinds of things happening in the world. No, but it was also something absolutely consistent with interests of mine for decades.
But was that so? So I guess you've always had a deep connection with academia. Have you ever left in a way, or is
No, no, I have not left. I mean, around 2013, I started to write criticism for non-academic publications, and I do quite a lot of that.
yeah?
And I also, do film programming, exhibition curating. So in that sense, my activities are not completely bound up in an academic context, but I would say that they always nonetheless stem from my training as an academic and my that I would say that's like my primary professional role or identity or something like that. Yeah.
I guess the reason why I'm asking the question is because academia has its own pace and its own
Hmm.
kind of intensity. And I just wonder then how does that kind of foundation meet the kind of external world?
I mean, I think that there are things that academia gives me that I don't get from those other spheres, and there are things that writing criticism and curating can give me that I don't get from academia, and so they sort of supplement each other. I mean, there's obviously a very different pace sometimes in academia, and I think I like being able to give a project what it needs. And sometimes it's, publishing very quickly a review of something that one sees. But at another moment in time, it might mean taking years to develop a research project, learning a new language in order to be able to do archival research or, and really taking the time to do it properly. And so, one could see that as like a clash of different ways of working, of different temporalities. But I would say that for me, these things feel like they work together in more or less harmonious ways.
I think I'm kind of as you were saying that I was going back to this notion that you kind of so beautifully articulated earlier that basically this inquiry of yours is not really related or it doesn't get presented through a piece a work that you let's say study but you have a much more sort of networked kind of understanding, so it's really about like cultural shifts or cultural
But
kind of
also technological, also representational, institutional, so it's like, I think, the work of the historian or something like that is about finding ways to understand the interactions between these different levels of activity or analysis.
mhm.
Like I've written a lot, for instance, about histories of technological change, like this Polavision project, or like I've, written about the development of video projection. That's not just a cultural shift, that's actually about tracing certain technological moments and what gets opened or closed by the appearance of a new technology, and then what artists end up doing with that.
And what
So there can be different layers.
how much do you value I guess how much do you value future in a sense, so much of the work is historical and it's tracing historical processes and developments and movements. But I wonder how much do you then think about future?
Not very much, in fact. I write a lot about contemporary work.
Yeah.
So, I know I've been saying like, oh, I'm a historian and na. But, in my work as a critic, I'm responding often quite quickly to contemporary work as it's happening, and I think that there is, again, this temporality of critical writing that is different from the temporality of academic scholarship, and criticism is much more suited to, respond quickly. There's the thing that always gets said, which is that, reviews are the first draft of history, or journalism is the first draft of history. And, that holds true in film criticism and art criticism. So I respond a lot to contemporary work, but I don't think it's my role to speculate on the future. I
Hmm.
simply don't. And, you know, um, I think that that's sometimes when film scholars or scholars of technology try to do that, I find it very misguided.
Yes, and presumably also will always be in the future. So then you will see that, I guess,
Hmm.
writing that you've done, the kind of instant reaction, and you will then be able to judge your own kind of initial reading of it. Did you ever find yourself disagreeing with yourself?
Disagreeing, I don't know, but I mean, I think it would be more like positions could be refined over time,
Mhm.
sharpened, nuanced. I haven't had the situation of publishing something and then later coming to feel that it was like absolutely wrong or something like that. But one is always writing in response to a particular moment, to a particular state of affairs. And as things move on, it can become possible to refine that position or update that position, in relation to further developments. So that certainly happens.
I think the maybe I don't know if that was the first time I encountered your work, but I think it was certainly when I first thought, oh, I'd love to talk to Eric. It was actually when I was reading your work in relation to Eric Baudelaire's work,
Uh-huh.
which I think he's one of the people I also interviewed for this
Hmm. Hmm.
panel. But I wonder maybe whether we could talk a little bit about Eric Baudelaire's work and whether I guess the writing on some of those works was actually probably done at a time when the works were first screened or when they were made. And I feel Eric's work is, I feel it's gaining a greater urgency or relevance, even though, of course, it was always relevant. But I just wonder on that example, can you see a change of perception of the work?
Eric is an artist that I admire tremendously. I don't feel that my understanding of the work has changed particularly. I guess I was interested in thinking about his work in relation to a kind of surge of documentary practices in contemporary art. One of the ways that the so-called documentary turn in contemporary art tends to be described is as mixing fiction and documentary, as really plagued by a sense of doubt. But I think some of the people describing the documentary turn in this way would not use the word plagued in the way that I just did, because for them, this idea of doubt is something actually very good, generative, productive, indicative of a sort of sophisticated approach to the question of truth and reality. And I had the feeling that there were an array of practices that were widely acknowledged to be important parts of contemporary experimental documentary that were not accounted for by the kinds of things that were often said about the documentary turning contemporary art as always being about fictionalization, hybridity, doubt, and so on. And so I was interested in the way that many artists had taken up practices of observation. And this was one of the things that was very interesting to me in Eric's work because, his engagement with Masao Adachi in the Anabasis and in also known as serial killer, or also known as jihadi in his case, but
I,
his engagement with Adachi and the idea of landscape theory, to me was like a very interesting technique to sort of bring back in our moment. And so I was trying to basically think through, what for Eric and some of these other artists was at stake in reclaiming observation as a strategy after it had been somewhat discredited by a discourse around postmodern documentary practice.
And okay, so I think it's interesting that of course the value you place to that work has not changed, but I guess whether that probably would have been like 5 years ago that maybe engagement with that work
A
maybe like
little before, yeah, the 2017.
yeah, okay, but then since then has documentary evolved or changed? What would you say? Like, have you seen any kind of significant?
I don't think that aspect has changed. I think that there's still a large interest in these docufictional forms, contaminated forms, and that's also okay. I'm not against work like that. A lot of that work can be tremendously interesting. I just felt that the discourse, had not taken account of the fact that there are lots of experimental documentary practices that don't fall within that kind of characterization. And so I wanted to expand the frame a little bit. But no, I mean, I would say in a general way that a lot of what used to be called avant-garde filmmaking has now kind of become what often gets called experimental documentary and has brought these spheres together um, in a kind of unprecedented way. And a lot of the work that I've done, especially as a critic, is in trying to write about those kinds of practices.
Is it innovation that strikes you?
Innovation is a word that immediately sounds to me like Silicon Valley or something, and it immediately, makes me bristle. So
Mhm.
I would not describe it in that way, but obviously, one wants to see work that feels like it's pushing something or doing something interesting that maybe hasn't been done before in precisely that way. And in that sense, I mean, we could say that that's a certain kind of innovation, but, not in any programmatic way, like the very name, the avant-garde, presumes some sort of linear
Uniformity.
trajectory forward where one is advancing, a set of positions in a militaristic way. And I just don't think that this is a kind of way of conceptualizing what happens in experimental practice anymore. And that word avant-garde, within filmmaking is not used so much anymore. It's become something that is more or less a historical term. And now there are other labels that are used to describe the kinds of practices that once upon a time would have been called avant-garde filmmaking. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this work, this experimental documentary work, is interested in some sense in producing knowledge about the world. And in reflecting on, not just what we see or what we know, but how we can see or how we can know it, or even how, our vision is blocked or paths to knowledge are blocked. And so, this is something that I think remains, a kind of compelling form of practice.
And so I guess, but then what's compelling in the work that does that, that succeeds in that?
I mean, I don't know that it's something that can be so generalized,
Hmm.
but I guess I still, to some degree, hold on to the idea that the sphere of artist filmmaking has some sort of oppositional value or should have some kind of potential to offer an alternative kind of way of seeing, mode of perception, way of thinking, that is not just replicating what we have in mass culture. I think there are other people who conceive of, artists, moving image practices very differently. But for me, something about that friction is important. I'm not interested in practices that sort of duplicate the habits or representational systems and so on of mass culture at large. So that would be one thing. Um, but I mean there are lots of different ways of thinking about what makes a good artwork or an interesting artwork, and it can sometimes have to do with like how a work is intervening into like a particular situation. It can sometimes have to do with, visual sensory pleasures. There are so many different ways, and I'm just not interested in being like that programmatic critic who says, here are my criteria for what art is supposed to be doing, I don't think it's a cop out to say that in fact there are like many possible avenues, many different ways a work could be good or interesting or important.
What's very interesting in the way that, for example, in the way that I've used film in my own pedagogy has always been as a kind of observational tool and, allowing, let's say, architecture students to kind of direct their gaze in a very specific direction. So in a sense, even though we kind of encourage plurality in how they do that and how whatever the outcomes of their works are, I think there is a set principle with which they operate. And what I'm really enjoying in the way that you're kind of trying to dismantle these notions of kind of clear rule or trick by which something is done. And in a way, you're almost anti-genre.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because genre, that's like in a way the realm of popular cinema, which I also love. I'm a huge fan of various kinds of Hollywood cinema from the last 100 years or whatever. But, it's an industry that is absolutely predicated on replicating sameness. And, genre is about the iteration of conventions that are principally the same with small levels of variation. And we can also talk about certain kinds of genres in artist filmmaking, for instance. But, often when I am talking to friends of mine who are programmers or curators, and they're talking about what their dissatisfaction is with certain contemporary work, it's that sometimes it feels as if those works can too easily be slotted into an existing genre or subgenre, a certain kind of category, a recognizable type of work. Whereas actually, the whole point, I guess, of artist moving image, experimental film is to be sort of inventing new forms for and in the case of experimental documentary works, inventing forms that somehow can accommodate the kinds of thinking or the relationship to reality or whatever the artist wants to engage. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess in a certain sense, I'm anti-genre in terms of what I think makes an interesting or good contemporary artwork. But on the other hand, I'm not immune to the pleasures of genre in the sense that, I also think it's really very interesting to watch. For instance, I don't know, a cycle of 40s women's melodramas and see all of the different kind of intricate play with convention that can happen within them. But, that's a different kind of cinema than the one that I focus on in my own work.
But I wonder in the films that you focus on, whether there is a sense of validation of the work by like, let's say, becoming influential and therefore becoming almost like a prelude to a potential genre. Do you ever find that sometimes the best of those, I don't know if we are able to be qualitative here, but like if the work is really good, then it actually has a potential to kind of kick off a genre. Do you ever
Yeah,
think?
I guess. I mean, imitation is pervasive,
Hmm.
and so for instance, if we think about the proliferation of essayistic forms in the last like 15, 20 years, like, of course, think about how many imitators there are of people like Harun Farokhi or Hito Steyerl, But on the other hand, Harun Farokhi and Hito Steyerl themselves were drawing on other kinds of precedents. It's maybe that they did so in, a fresher way in that moment. But then as time goes on, something then crystallizes very much into a genre. And so in the case of the essay film, the way that the essay film, was often theorized was as a break with genre. It's not quite fiction, it's not quite documentary. It's crossing part personal and public. It was always talked about as not quite being able to be defined within existing categories. Now I think we could very quickly lay out a series of characteristics that together would comprise the essay film as a genre. And that's because it has been iterated so much and has become so popular um, within the last 20 years or so.
Hmm. And so do you feel like that's part of your duty to when you kind of encounter work to kind of understand the lineage of thought that has led to it?
Exactly. Exactly. I think that's like what even good criticism does. Scholarship, certainly, but even I think writing as a critic, nothing comes out of nowhere.
Mhm.
It's not necessarily about even saying who the artist would identify consciously as their influences, because I don't think it's necessarily about conscious influence. It's more about, as a viewer, as a critic, how can I contextualize this work relative to various different genealogies that exist? Where can I place it? How can I situate it within these different trajectories? And I think that, I mean, that for me is what good criticism does. I'm not so much of a fan of this kind of belletristic criticism that's just sort of saying, this is how this artwork made me feel. There can be a little bit of that. But I think there also has to be, yeah, a clearer sense of a more historical project that undergirds the writing.
But then it's a quite do you feel like the weight on your shoulders of the authority to place work in its history?
I don't know if I really feel a weight. I work hard, I try my best, and so in that sense, it's not like I'm just saying whatever. It's very
Yes.
considered. But there's like a lot of discussion now about the liquidation of the critic's authority. I'm not sure how much authority any critic really has at this point in time. I'm just kind of like trying my best.
Okay, that's kind of critic in relation to the world, but then critic in relation to the artists themselves. I wonder whether there is a kind of, because actually you said yourself that actually an artist might not acknowledge the either influences or the lineage that a critic might very clearly see. So how do you then balance that relationship? Like a lot of the artists that you're interested in are alive and practicing, and their practices are evolving and developing. So I wonder then, where does that place you in relation to the artists?
It can depend on the publication format. If one is commissioned to write for an exhibition catalog, it is a slightly different kind of assignment than a review,
Mm.
where there is like a greater distance. I'm certainly interested in what artists think and say about their own work, but I would say that that's only one discourse of many. I don't think that it is the authoritative discourse about the work. And I think that there are artists, I mean, Eric is a really great example. There are artists who are extremely well versed in the
Mm.
histories in which they are working and
Yes, yeah.
extremely well versed in philosophy, theory, and so on. There are other artists who work from a very different place, and that's also okay. I'm not, here to ventriloquize the artist. They can speak on behalf of themselves. I'm speaking from my position. And maybe there are times when I, you know, disagree with the artist, but that's also okay.
So where does the authority sit? Is the authority with the work? Is the authority with the artist? Is the authority with the critic? Is the authority with the impact of the work?
I don't even know that I would speak in terms of authority because that kind of suggests that it has to be in one or another of those places. Whereas perhaps it's something much more dispersed and at different moments and at different contexts, in different contexts, one or the other can take precedence, you know? So, like, it's absolutely valid for an artist to do an in conversation at their exhibition opening with the exhibition curator and voice their account of their own work. And in that moment, of course, they have the authority to speak about their own work. But then a critic can come and review that exhibition, completely ignore everything the artist says, and have their own opinion, and they are entitled to that. So I think it's complicated. I would say that I am interested in the artist discourse as just one among many, so not as the sort of truth of the work. I would say also that when I write, I try to do justice to the work itself in the sense that I try to understand it on its own terms in some way, um, as opposed to coming with a preconceived idea of like how things should be, or, you know, I do try to sort of think from within the artwork, which of course is a place I can never access. But to some degree, to think, okay, like what are the strategies of this? How does it fit within these histories? But at the same time, yeah, I can't be within the artwork. I'm always coming from my own position. I'm always bringing, my own knowledge, my own blind spots, my own personal taste, my formation, and so on. So again, it's an encounter, no, rather than a sense of authority residing in one place or the other. It's like anything that I write is born of an encounter between myself and the artwork.
And Erica, do you feel like this is you charting a new territory, a space for a critic, for
No,
how critics should behave? Or do you
no.
also think that you as a critic have
I
uh,
think this is a very typical way that many critics would describe what they do. I don't think there's anything unusual or new about understanding the act of writing criticism in that way or taking up that attitude.
but surely through your practice, which really could be seen as practice, you are developing certain core beliefs and set of parameters within which you say, well, I'm going to approach things from this either point of view or with this set of
I
things.
mean, it may be that they exist,
Mhm.
but articulating them or dwelling on them or formalizing them is not really of interest to me. And I
So,
also think I work in different ways in different circumstances, like writing an academic article is a different thing than writing a catalog essay, is a different thing than writing a review. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. This is what you were saying earlier, that actually you operate on different
Mm.
levels.
Mm.
Well, because the thing is, every level at which you operate has its own framework, no? And so you're plugging into a kind of a mass digestible piece of writing as opposed to a piece of writing that can be a bit more complex and layered.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are moments when it's less clear for me, like, is this criticism, is this scholarship there? I mean, it's definitely very blurred. But then there are other moments in which it's really not blurred, like responding quickly in 1,000 words to a newly released artist film is a really different thing than spending years doing historical research on an Italian feminist collective. which is what I'm doing right now, for instance, you know? And so there are completely different modes of engagement, I would say. And the motivations are different and so on. But I think, it's good to have that kind of variety and to respond to the work in the way that it demands. I mean, I think there are academics who write about extremely contemporary work within an academic framework. Sometimes it's good, sometimes though I think it really suffers because um, it's not punctual enough to be punctual, but it's kind of not historical either, and then it kind of gets stranded in this in-between zone. Um, and I think, I in a way prefer certain modes of engagement with contemporary work and then other modes of engagement with historical work.
And how do you engage with, let's say, political plurality, like left and right? How do you handle that kind of,
I
I
mean,
guess,
I don't handle it in the sense that I'm really not interested in engaging with right-wing perspectives in any way. I'm just really not.
but but I guess when you're not, then that is the dealing with that is your way of dealing with this, I guess.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I speak from my own position, and I have my own viewpoints on things, and they, I think, are broadly all contained within the left side of the spectrum. And I think that, they're very clear in the things that I write, and I don't hide them, and I don't like purport to speak from a position of neutrality.
But so and so like in the way in which you approach, let's say, artist experimental work, of course I think there is a very clear understanding as to how that is seen. Like it can be, I guess, seen or read or understood from the left side of the spec of the kind of this kind of political divide. But I guess on the right side sit things like genre, or am I mistaken?
I don't think
Um,
there's anything right wing about genre or about
well,
Hollywood even, or, I
well,
mean,
like as in economic terms, it's a mode of kind of
it's highly
capitalist
capitalized for sure, but
production. Yeah.
that's not the same thing as right wing.
Okay, okay. I mean, yes, of course.
I mean, and there are also, for instance, like if you think about the project that Tom Anderson and Noel Birch did on Red Hollywood, that's looking at communists in Hollywood and different films in which like they wrote screenplays or directed in ways that sort of are coming from a left position from, within the belly of the beast of Hollywood. And so, yeah, we can't, it's not like, oh, all experimental film is like radically progressive and all Hollywood film is reactionary. I think that's like a
But so where does the left manifest? Does it manifest just purely ideologically across the spectrum, or there is something in the mode of production that also can kind of
well, modes of production are also ideological. So I
yeah.
don't think we can say, is it ideological or is it in the mode of production?
I
But
guess,
I
but I
would
guess mode
say
of
in the
sorry.
mode of production, also in the kind of representational systems and by that I mean like at the level of content, at the level of form. We can think about a politics of making, a politics of content, a politics of form, a politics of exhibition. There are lots of different ways of thinking about this.
But they can be mismatched, right? So
Of
let's say
course, I don't know. Capitalism and right wing at this point, I don't think are exactly the same thing. And so I also wouldn't think, I don't think that that should be conflated in such an easy way. Yeah, of course, there can be mismatches. I mean, Camoli and Narboni, Cinema Ideology Criticism, the Cahiers du Cinema editorial from 1969 is all about mapping the different kinds of relations that can exist between a politics of form and a politics of content. And one of the things that they say is that, a film that has a sort of like progressive content, if it uses a conventional form, is not an adequately political film. That doesn't mean it's a right-wing film
Mhm.
per se, I would say.
Yeah, no, absolutely,
But it does
absolutely.
mean that it's a film that for them is inadequately political.
But from the point of view of the critic, is this an important thing to understand about the work?
In the encounter with the work, there are certain things that strike you as being the things that are worth talking about, you know? And so maybe there are films that, well, like Barbie, a film I would never write about because I don't want to, add my voice to all of that. But that's a great example of a film that is like ostensibly progressive at the level of representation, but absolutely not in terms of its mode of production and in terms of its formal style.